After multiple relationships ending in failure, she was looking for the right man to spend her life with.
She's trying to find people that will give her the love that she so greatly desires.
Eventually, she met a man that was just as gorgeous as she was.
She thought there's still hope for me, and I'm gonna seize this moment.
But a violent encounter turns her fairy tale romance into a horror story.
Her body was found in a ditch.
There are numerous stab wounds.
Whoever did this wanted to make sure that she suffered.
The search for a suspect leads detectives in multiple directions.
She was involved with a lot of different romantic interests.
Did arguments ever get physical?
Yeah, but that happens sometimes.
They couldn't have a civil conversation. It was very volatile.
I be telling, be careful who you're dealing with.
He is an individual that sort of has put himself in a savior position.
But would her savior eventually become her downfall?
There's a thin line between love and hate.
She's cursing at me. You ain't, you don't have this, you don't have that.
Over time, you start to need the high.
It's like having the devil on one shoulder and the angel on the other shoulder.
I believe that she was possessed by some demon.
2015. It's a warm Sunday morning in Delray Beach, a quaint coastal town along Florida's Atlantic shore.
Delray Beach is actually a much different vibe than some of your more common places in South Florida. Delray Beach is a much slower pace.
You see people fishing, you see the boats in the canals. That's kind of what people are about, just the natural beauty, the relaxation, the water.
But around 9 a.m. this morning, a local resident is traveling along a remote stretch of road when he spots something unusual.
He noticed something that looked suspicious in a ditch. And as he got closer, he did realize that it was a young lady.
He sees her laying in the grass, unresponsive, and, he's not sure what's wrong. He contacts 911.
First responders race to the location.
Protocol when someone's unresponsive is to get to the scene as soon as possible because there's a possibility that person still could be alive.
They had no idea if this woman was having a medical issue or what was going on.
When Palm Beach County deputies arrive on the scene, they quickly realize they're too late to help the young woman.
The police get there, and it becomes immediately apparent that obviously she is deceased.
Her body was cold to the touch, so police knew that she had been dead for some time.
At that point, you realize there's no saving this person. Now your job is to preserve the scene.
And as deputies begin to secure the area, they notice something lying near the woman's body.
There was a wallet on the ground next to the body, and inside of that wallet, police found an ID card.
They quickly identified who she was.
Her name was Vanessa Williams.
28-year-old single mother Vanessa Williams had a smile that could light up a room.
She was this beautiful young lady.
She was very social and enjoyed spending time with her friends.
Ambitious and caring to her core, Vanessa had always dreamed of becoming a therapist. But a relationship from her teenage years with a handsome classmate named Nate Tyler had taken her on a different path.
They were high school sweethearts who were very much in love.
Vanessa was so certain that they would go the distance that she even got Nate's name tattooed on her neck. But when she got pregnant, it caused a lot of friction between the two of them.
The stress of teenage parenthood was too much for their relationship to bear, and the couple parted ways soon after the birth of their son.
On her own, as a single parent, she resolved to give her son the best life she could manage. But she kind of had to put her dreams of becoming a therapist on hold.
She was a wonderful mom.
Vanessa managed to finish school while juggling motherhood, But instead of going to college, she jumped into a relationship with a new partner, a man named Stuart Bird.
After graduating from high school, she pretty immediately fell in love with another man from town. They moved in together, and he started helping her with her son.
Well, hey there. How was work?
Oh, busy.
Stuart seemed like someone who would take care of her. He had a lot of love for his family, and that was something that Vanessa really appreciated about him.
They talked about getting married and having kids together.
But it was another union that wasn't meant to last.
Their relationship eventually became a little bit toxic.
They split up after 3 years together.
By her mid-20s, Vanessa once again found herself struggling as a single mom.
She went on with her life, trying to pick up the pieces, but she never gave up on love.
She's trying to find different people that will give her the love she so greatly desires. And she's meeting disappointment after disappointment with the types of men that she's involved with.
Finally, in 2011, Vanessa met a man who seemed different from the rest.
Excuse me, miss?
Yeah.
I think you dropped this.
Oh, thank you.
John Chapman was a handsome military veteran, young, fit, knew how to present himself.
They were two very good-looking young people who immediately were attracted to one another.
I don't mean to be too forward, but do you think I can get your phone number?
Sure. Yeah.
As they got to know each other over the coming weeks, John and Vanessa realized they were both looking for the same things in life.
John wanted a big family. He wanted kids. They realized maybe we could build this life together.
So I've never really been with somebody who's felt like a life partner. I've always ended up alone.
Those days are over. I promise.
He was Prince Charming for her. So she and John Chapman fell in love. They started dating.
Vanessa felt like she'd finally found a relationship that would last.
Things were going really well for Vanessa this time around.
With John's help at home, she was able to focus a little bit more on herself. She was working as a medical assistant during the day and taking classes at night so that she could work towards her dreams of becoming a therapist.
But now, instead of seeing her dreams come true, Vanessa Williams has been found dead in a secluded area of Palm Beach County.
Police quickly went into trying to find out what had happened to this beautiful young lady.
They weren't sure if this was some sort of accident or if she was out walking when maybe she suffered some type of medical emergency.
When detectives arrive on the scene, they move in for a closer look at Vanessa's body.
When the police turn over the body, there are numerous stab wounds on her face, on her neck, on her back.
Vanessa was stabbed over 23 times. Whoever did this wanted to make sure that she suffered bad.
After a series of failed relationships, 28-year-old Vanessa Williams finally found a man to stand by her side.
You have John as this military man, and he looks refined, and he's showing himself in a way that, hey, I'm strong and I can protect you. And this is the kind of strength that she's looking for.
The happy couple was looking forward to a bright future together. But now, Vanessa has been found dead on the side of a remote road in Palm Beach County.
It's the beginning of the investigation. They don't have all the information, but from what they've seen so far, this appears to be gruesome, violent.
They were able to determine that Vanessa had been stabbed 23 times.
The question now is, why?
They find money, they find jewelry. Her chain is still on her.
The fact those property pieces that were still there with her indicated not a robbery.
They believe that this is a personal attack. This was someone who had malice and anger, and they took it out on Vanessa Williams.
However, due to a lack of blood pooling, investigators suspect that the violent stabbing didn't happen here.
Law enforcement concludes that she must have been killed somewhere else and brought to this location.
It almost looked like there was an intent to try and hide her location, maybe a hasteful attempt at best.
There are other things there that indicate that they left in a hurry. They see an indentation from where a tire was. They find a flip-flop.
It looked like when Vanessa's body was dragged out of whatever vehicle it was in, all this other debris got dragged out with her.
One item in particular stands out to the investigators.
They find a floor mat from a vehicle that's soaked in blood, and they really want to know whose blood is this? Does this belong to the victim?
It's also potential evidence for DNA from the assailant. Most stabbings or cuttings, the person who is the attacker will typically injure themselves.
Detectives spot another crucial piece of evidence left behind by Vanessa's killer.
They find a wooden-handled knife that looks like it could be the murder weapon.
After the evidence is bagged and sent out for testing, Vanessa's body is transported to the medical examiner's office for an autopsy.
Judging by the degree of lividity in Vanessa's body, the medical examiner believes that she had been dead for about 24 hours.
Lividity is the accumulation of the blood in the lower extremities of the body.
A blood test reveals another surprising new piece of information, that at the time of her death, Vanessa had a street drug known as Flocka in her system.
Flocka came in, I believe, around 2015, 2014 in the Florida area here. There was a lot of reports of crazy behavior, zombie-like behavior, aggressiveness, extreme strength.
Flocka took bath salts and it was manipulated, and it gave you a much more intense high and hallucinations, and anybody could pretty much get their hands on it.
Immediately, law enforcement are thinking that maybe this was some drug deal gone wrong. Maybe this was a drug user who had crossed someone.
Armed with this new information, detectives begin trying to learn more about who their victim was.
One of the things that they observed that the medical examiner told them about was that there is a tattoo on the back of Vanessa's neck, and the name of that tattoo was Nate.
Vanessa's social media appears to confirm that she had a man in her life around the time she died. But his name isn't Nate. It's John Chapman.
One of the first places police look is to the boyfriend. He is a former military guy, someone that police can identify with.
When police spoke with John, he was devastated to find out what had happened to his girlfriend. He said that she was a wonderful mom, a great person.
I hate to be the one to tell you.
John strikes the detectives as sad, but not especially surprised.
I was afraid something like this might happen.
He said she had some habits that she had fallen into, involving drugs and alcohol.
John tells the police that Vanessa's drug use had been getting worse lately. A lot worse.
It started out, I just had a long day at work, and I just need a little something to take the edge off. But over time, you start to need the high.
Vanessa had her struggles, And with her having children, with her having the responsibility of being a mother, of being a partner, trying to co-parent, there are certain things that contributed to her drug use.
Vanessa, seriously? This is getting way out of hand.
John Chapman told them that Vanessa had been out of control, and in one of those drug and alcohol-fueled incidents, she left.
How about you stop telling me how to live my life?
He said she had taken off without telling him where she was going.
He tried to call her to figure out where she was. He couldn't get in contact with her.
I thought that I was gonna be able to see her again, but...
Do you know anyone that might want to hurt her? Drug dealer, ex-boyfriend?
I know she had issues with her ex.
John actually shared with police that Vanessa's relationship with Stewart was extremely toxic. They couldn't have a civil conversation. It was very volatile.
They had some mutual friends and would run into each other from time to time. And Stewart would always try to weasel his way back in.
She couldn't fully get away from this guy.
And according to John Chapman, Stewart Bird had a history of domestic violence against Vanessa Williams. He had attacked her in the past, and of course, John felt like he would do it again.
I didn't trust her, and I know she didn't either.
He told the police that that's the place where they should start looking.
John was adamant that Stewart Bird had something to do with this.
Vanessa Williams' boyfriend, John Chapman, has just told Palm Beach County Police that she was battling drug addiction in the months before she was murdered.
Vanessa was a mom, a student, a healthcare worker, and unfortunately, she had turned to substances to deal with all of the stressors in her life.
Before you know it, we're self-medicating. And so where someone may say, you know, that could never be me, before you know it, it is you.
According to John, Vanessa had been behaving increasingly erratically in the weeks before she was killed. And shortly before her body was discovered, she'd complained about running into her ex, Stewart Bird.
After getting this information, police immediately went into the background of Stewart, and they discovered that he had an extensive record. He had burglary, domestic strangulation, grand theft, and child abuse.
At that moment, Stewart Bird became suspect number one.
But when detectives bring Stewart in for questioning, he seems shocked.
Stewart denied having any responsibility for killing Vanessa.
What? No. Listen, y'all have the wrong guy.
However, he does acknowledge there were moments in their 3-year relationship he's not proud of.
He admitted that things got pretty heated between them.
Did arguments ever get physical between the two of you?
Yeah. But that happens sometimes.
With that relationship, there was domestic violence.
It shows his ability, his possibility of creating a violent scenario with Vanessa.
They want to know, where were you on the night of April the 18th?
According to Stewart, he has an alibi for the night Vanessa was killed.
Stewart Bird tells them, well, I was working all night. He gives them the name of his employer.
You can call my supervisor right now, he'll tell you.
Police were able to contact his employer, who confirmed that Stewart was definitely at work on the night that Vanessa was murdered. So now they're back to square one.
Eager to drum up new leads, police shift their focus to the people who knew Vanessa best.
Vanessa's parents lived about an hour away in Miami, and while they were still grieving the loss of their daughter, they were ready to talk to detectives.
Vanessa's parents were devastated. It is extremely heartbreaking as a parent to know that your child was killed.
Vanessa's parents tell detectives that their daughter had a long history of troubled relationships.
I always tell them, men wants only your money and something else.
Right.
And I be telling them, be careful who you're dealing with.
So in cases like this, either you have a lot of suspects or you have nobody. And this case had a lot of suspects. She was involved with a lot of different romantic interests.
Vanessa's parents also confirm what John Chapman said in his interview about Vanessa's rampant drug use.
She went use the drugs.
You know what kind of drugs? Cocaine?
I don't know. That I don't know.
She was dealing with a lot. It's like having the devil on one shoulder and the angel on the other shoulder. I have my responsibilities, but I don't know how to cope.
Vanessa's parents say the last time they saw their daughter was about a week ago when she stopped by for a surprise visit.
What time was that?
Around 5 something. 5:30.
What kind of car did she have?
She didn't have a car. She said it's a friend car. She was driving a truck.
What kind of truck?
White, I think white, I don't know if it's a Ford.
The truck was alleged to have belonged to Corey Summers, a friend of hers.
But other than Corey's name, Vanessa's parents know nothing about him.
I met it once.
Okay.
After Vanessa left in Corey's truck, her parents never heard from her again.
I started texting her, but I never had no response from her.
Did you call her after that? Did you ever, after that point, talk to her again?
Never.
Based on this information, investigators want to speak with Corey Summers as soon as possible.
The question now was, did Corey have a reason to want Vanessa dead?
After speaking with her parents, Florida detectives have learned that Vanessa Williams was last seen driving her friend Corey Summers' truck around the time she was killed.
Did you ever, after that point, talk to her again?
Never.
When detectives reach out to Corey Summers, they're surprised to hear he's been waiting for a call from law enforcement.
What's that?
Corey thought the police were calling about his truck, the one that he had allegedly let Vanessa borrow.
Corey explains that he's a long-haul trucker who'd been out on the road until a few days earlier.
When he came back from one of his long-haul trips on April 17th, his truck was missing. There was a police report made.
When detectives explain they're calling under graver circumstances, Corey seems grief-stricken.
Here's the deal. We're working a homicide investigation. Vanessa's dead.
I don't believe that.
He agrees to come into the police station to give an official statement.
Corey confirmed that he and Vanessa were friends, and he said he allowed her to stay at his place after she and her boyfriend John got into a huge argument about her drug use.
She asked me to stay. I told her okay because I don't hardly ever be home.
He says that Vanessa has stayed with me from time to time. I've allowed her to crash here when she's needed to. I'll see her, and then I'll go out on the road for several days, and then I'll come back.
Corey insists the relationship between them was entirely platonic.
One of the things I gotta ask you, were you intimate at all, you and her?
No.
Never?
No.
Okay.
Corey, he is an individual that sort of has put himself in a savior position. He tries to help people. He's trying to help Vanessa, trying to give her a place to stay.
They had an arrangement where Corey would allow Vanessa to use his pickup truck while he was out on the road.
She doesn't have the transportation to get and back and forth from work.
Okay.
So I told her to use my truck. Just be careful with it.
But the last time he got home, Corey says Vanessa and his truck were gone.
Vanessa was missing, and his apartment was in shambles, as if there had been a struggle or fight going on in there.
I know she had company, but I don't know who she had there.
He didn't know what happened. He tried to reach out to her. He couldn't get in contact with her.
In speaking with Corey, he seemed to be very forthcoming, very cooperative, very willing to help the police, but they are not sure if they are able to trust him.
Again, I gotta ask you this, because if it comes out later on, I want to make sure we're clear. Did you guys have any intimate relationship between you two?
A long time ago.
When was that?
Last month ago.
But before you told me that you didn't.
We're not really sure if there's a relationship there. Maybe, maybe not. So you have to look at that. Was he jealous?
But Corey insists he wasn't even in the same state at the time when police believe Vanessa was killed.
I was in Georgia.
You were in Jersey?
Georgia.
At the end of the interview, Corey agrees to turn his cell phone over to police.
We need your phone just to make sure everything checks out.
Sure, okay.
And while it's sent out for analysis, detectives track down the last name on their list. The father of Vanessa's oldest son, Nate Tyler.
Although he and Vanessa broke up years ago, they were still on good terms for the sake of their son.
They were extremely close, although they were only platonic.
And according to Nate, the last time he saw Vanessa, she'd confided in him that she was struggling.
You know, she had been telling me things weren't going well with John, her boyfriend. And she'd been staying with some other guy, Corey, I think.
Yeah, we've already talked to Corey.
Nate tells the investigators that on another occasion, he'd witnessed the tension between Vanessa and John firsthand.
There was an incident that Nate shared with police where they were all hanging out and something transpired that really ticked John off to the extent that he started throwing furniture, became vulgar, got very violent.
It was shocking, you know? It happened out of nowhere.
Did Vanessa say these type of outbursts happen often?
Yeah, she did.
She told him that John was abusive, that John would go fly off the handle for different reasons.
She confided in Nate about all of the threatenings, the stalkings, the verbal abuse, the beatings that she was getting.
Based on what they're hearing from Nate, detectives have to wonder, has John been misleading them all along?
At this point, getting out there, finding John, and getting face-to-face with John is very important.
But when detectives try to bring John Chapman in for another round of questioning, they quickly hit a roadblock.
They'd say, we gotta pick this guy up and talk to him again. But there's only one problem. He's gone. He's on the run.
In the spring of 2015, Palm Beach County investigators have had no shortage of suspects in the murder of 28-year-old Vanessa Williams. So far, they've spoken with her ex, Stuart Bird, close friend, Corey Summers, and even her high school sweetheart, Nate Tyler. But unfortunately, all three men seem to have airtight alibis.
Thanks to phone records, police were able to confirm that their three prior suspects had not been in the area at the time Vanessa was murdered.
Stuart was confirmed to be at work, and Corey in Georgia. And Nate was out of town visiting some friends.
However, in speaking with Nate Tyler, investigators have unearthed a new suspect, a man they're already familiar with, Vanessa's most recent boyfriend, John Chapman.
According to Nate, Vanessa had confided in him about her very tumultuous relationship with John.
John had been abusing her, both physically and verbally.
She was trying to get away from John. She was trying to cut ties with him.
He conducted himself in a way that was reckless, dangerous, and possibly deadly.
Detectives want to speak with John Chapman again as soon as possible, but they'll have to find him first.
He's gone. He's on the run.
He wasn't at home or at work. He wasn't answering his phone.
Detectives think John may be traveling in Corey Summers' missing pickup truck. And before long, they receive a promising tip about the stolen vehicle's location.
There was actually an APB put out on Corey's truck, and they found it in front of the home of a Lana Palmer.
Lana Palmer is alleged to have been romantically involved with John Chapman. They had an on-again, off-again relationship between the two of them.
By the time police respond, the truck is gone.
They go in there, no John Chapman, but they do find Lana Palmer.
Can I help you? When they questioned Lana about the truck in front of her home, she admitted that John had come by.
The last time that she saw John Chapman, on April the 18th, he came there driving a white truck, clothes covered in blood.
John? Oh my God, what did you do? He was very bloody. He looked like he had been through just too much. And showing up to her home, asking for refuge, if you will.
She asked him, "What happened, John?"
He said he'd been fighting with someone. I could tell he was lying, though.
Baby, I had to defend myself.
He told her that he had gotten into a fight with one of Vanessa's ex-boyfriends. She didn't believe the story, but since he was acting so weird, she just allowed him to come inside, take a shower, and clean up.
Okay, just go rinse all that off, please.
But after John washed up, Lana witnessed more strange behavior from him.
She saw him take a SIM card out of a phone and rip it in half.
She realized that there was something awry here, and the story that he was given just didn't line up.
I don't know what you're up to, but I want you out. Told him to get out, and he did.
Do you have any idea where he may have went?
No, not a clue.
She said he took his things and he left.
Lana insists she hasn't seen or heard from John since that night. And with no other leads on their suspect's location, investigators are back at square one.
They start to intensify their efforts to find him because the clock is ticking.
As an investigator, you need to get to John as soon as possible.
Police reached out to law enforcement agencies in the surrounding areas to be on the lookout for John. They also enlisted the aid of the U.S. Marshals to help look for him.
Soon, their efforts pay off.
Eventually, they got a tip that the truck had been seen in Miami.
The tip led them to an apartment complex where they found the truck parked outside.
And inside the truck, police make an alarming discovery.
There's blood everywhere.
Based on the amount of blood, police believe that this may be where Vanessa was killed.
They found a green purse that they thought must have belonged to Vanessa, as well as a flip-flop that matched the one found at the body's dump site.
Now more than ever, investigators know they need to track down John Chapman.
Investigators go door to door looking for John Chapman. They don't find him anywhere. But what they do discover is near to that apartment complex is a homeless shelter.
Inside the homeless shelter, police finally locate John.
As he's getting dressed, they take him into custody. The police have their man.
Back in Palm Beach, detectives are eager to sit down with their #1 suspect.
They immediately started peppering him with questions about what had happened to Vanessa, and to their surprise, he didn't hold back.
Vanessa was, she wasn't herself at all. I had to kill her.
John finally confessed to the murder.
But that's not all he says.
He tells them that it was in self-defense. He said she attacked him with a knife.
I believe that she was possessed by some demon.
Palm Beach County detectives have finally arrested John Chapman for the murder of his 28-year-old girlfriend, Vanessa Williams.
They take him into custody and they start to question him.
Now in the interrogation room, John has just made a stunning confession.
She wasn't herself at all. I had to kill her.
He tells them that it was in self-defense.
I would hate to say that I'm a spiritual person. Okay. But I believe that she was possessed by some demon.
John tells the investigators it all started when he went to see Vanessa at Corey Summers' house on the night of April 18th.
Let's start with what led to this.
Drugs.
Drugs?
He showed up at Corey's place to discuss their relationship and found her out of her mind on drugs.
When I got there, I realized that there was a lot of meth in the carpet.
Vanessa, what the hell are you doing?
He found Vanessa Williams searching the carpet for Flocka flakes.
He said now that he realized how deep in addiction she is, he realizes that he no longer wants to be with Vanessa.
John, can you help me?
He says it disgusted him that Vanessa Williams' drug use was so out of control.
John tells detectives he was ready to leave soon after arriving, but he was stranded.
He'd gotten dropped off at Corey's house, so he needed a ride back home.
I just wanted that ride back to Cape Coral. And I'm like, hey, let's have fun. Let's go ahead and let's head back to Cape Coral. Let's party.
When you say that, with drugs, everything?
Yeah.
John, with his narcissistic personality, realized that Vanessa was battling an addiction, and he was using that to control her.
On the drive to Cape Coral, the couple stopped to get some fast food. But as the sun set and they finished their meal, they got into a tense argument in the restaurant parking lot.
John was upset with Vanessa about her drug use, and Vanessa was upset with John in regards to the way he had been treating her in the relationship.
She's cursing at me, telling me, you don't have this, you don't have that.
Eventually, John says he had enough.
I really just wanted her to feel what I felt. I don't know how else to say it. I just really, I pulled her hair, and it was just gonna be like a tussle. Right. But what I didn't notice that she had in the truck was a little small knife.
He said she tried to attack him.
He had to wrestle the knife away from her.
When she went for that, I hit her right on top of the head. Okay. And I was like, don't you dare do that. And then, honestly, I snapped.
He became completely overwhelmed with rage.
It was quick and it was insane.
You know how many times you stabbed her? More than once?
The problem with that story is as soon as he got the knife away from her, there was no threat anymore. You don't go back and plunge it 20 other more times in her chest after you take control of the knife.
And instead of getting help, he dumped her body on the side of a remote road where he thought that no one would be able to tie the crime back to him.
John blames his military experience for the extreme violence of his attack.
John is claiming he went into defense mode as though he was still in the military.
My training kicks in. Okay. All the emotions locked into robotic.
My Army training kicked in. It's not an excuse to kill someone. Besides that, John admitted he started the physical altercation. So in reality, Vanessa was the one defending herself when she grabbed that knife.
John Chapman, at the end of their investigation, was booked and charged for murder.
At trial in January of 2018, the jury agrees with investigators. John's murder of Vanessa can't be chalked up to self-defense.
In the end, his self-defense was not bought by the jury. They found him guilty of second-degree murder, and the judge sentenced him to 48 years in prison.
John was very lucky that he was not sentenced to death and that he wound up being convicted with second-degree murder. That was because in the state of Florida, if it's a crime of passion, you can get second-degree murder.
Vanessa Williams will never get the chance to see.
There are places that seem destined to disappear. Not because the wind erases their footprints, or because time quietly buries their buildings beneath layers of forgotten earth. They disappear because the stories attached to them become too painful to remember, too complicated to tell, and too uncomfortable to fit into the simple versions of history that generations often inherit. In the spring of 1885, Frog Lake was one of those places. At first glance, it looked like hundreds of other isolated settlements scattered across the vast Canadian Northwest. A handful of wooden buildings stood against an endless horizon. Smoke drifted lazily from chimneys on cold mornings. Horses left fresh tracks through muddy paths as winter reluctantly surrendered to spring. Families greeted one another by name. Children recognized every face they passed. Nothing about the settlement suggested that history would remember it. Yet beneath that quiet routine, another reality was taking shape. Beyond the edges of the settlement, Indigenous communities faced a future that seemed to grow darker with every passing season. The buffalo herds that had sustained generations had almost vanished. Hunger was no longer an occasional visitor but a constant companion. Promises made in treaties collided with delayed supplies, shrinking resources, and growing distrust. Every meal became uncertain. Every conversation carried the weight of survival. To the settlers, these hardships often remained distant concerns. To many Cree families, they were impossible to escape. Between those two worlds stood fragile relationships built on necessity rather than understanding. Traders depended on local communities. Government representatives carried policies created thousands of miles away. Missionaries hoped faith could bridge divisions that politics could not. Leaders searched desperately for compromise while younger voices questioned whether compromise still had any meaning. Each side believed it understood the other. Each side misunderstood far more than it realized. The story that unfolds at Frog Lake is often reduced to a single phrase, a massacre. The word is factually accurate, but it is also incomplete. It tells us that lives were taken. It does not explain how years of fear, famine, political pressure, cultural collision, and broken expectations converged until one morning changed forever. History rarely erupts without warning. More often, it whispers. It whispers through empty food stores. Through unanswered requests. Through promises postponed. Through children asking when food will arrive. Through officials convinced they are maintaining order. Through leaders struggling to keep peace while watching their influence slowly disappear. Long before the first gunshot echoed across Frog Lake, another conflict had already begun. It unfolded in council meetings, around campfires, inside government offices, and across thousands of miles of prairie where survival itself had become uncertain. Some believed patience would prevail. Others believed patience had already cost them everything. Among those trying to hold peace together was a respected Cree leader remembered today as Big Bear. He argued for negotiation, believing that better terms could still be achieved before surrendering what remained of his people's independence. But leadership becomes fragile when hunger grows stronger than hope. Every unsuccessful negotiation weakened his authority while strengthening those who believed that words alone would never change their future. As tension spread across the Northwest, news traveled slowly but carried enormous weight. Reports of armed resistance elsewhere fueled fear inside settlements and urgency among Indigenous communities already pushed to the edge. Rumors traveled faster than facts. Every distant confrontation seemed larger by the time it reached another camp or another trading post. People stopped seeing neighbors. They began seeing sides. The settlement at Frog Lake continued its daily routine almost as if history were happening somewhere else. Doors still opened each morning. Work still had to be done. Religious services still gathered familiar faces beneath the same roof. Ordinary life has a remarkable ability to continue even when extraordinary danger is drawing closer. No one wakes expecting to become part of history. No family imagines that an ordinary morning will become the last ordinary morning they ever know. The tragedy of Frog Lake is not simply the story of violence. It is the story of how fear can overtake reason, how desperation can fracture communities, and how human beings, placed under unbearable pressure, may make decisions that echo across generations. More than a century later, historians continue to examine what happened there, not because the answers are simple, but because they are not. Every document reveals another perspective. Every survivor's account adds another layer. Every generation asks new questions about responsibility, justice, leadership, and memory. This is not a story with uncomplicated heroes and villains. It is a story of individuals trapped inside forces far larger than themselves. Some made impossible choices. Some made terrible choices. Others had no opportunity to choose at all. To understand what happened at Frog Lake, we must begin long before that April morning. We must walk across the frozen prairie, listen to conversations carried by anxious voices, and see a frontier where hope and uncertainty lived side by side. Only then can we understand why one isolated settlement became one of the defining tragedies of the Northwest Rebellion, and why its legacy continues to challenge the way history itself is remembered. The land around Frog Lake stretched farther than the eye could comfortably follow. Endless prairie rolled into distant forests where trembling aspens caught the spring wind, their pale trunks standing like silent witnesses beneath a sky that seemed impossibly wide. In early April of 1885, winter had not fully surrendered its grip. Patches of snow still lingered in the shadows while muddy trails emerged wherever the afternoon sun found enough strength to soften the frozen earth. It was a season balanced between endings and beginnings, when every sunrise promised change, but no one could be certain whether that change would bring hope or hardship. For newcomers arriving from eastern Canada or Europe, the Northwest represented opportunity. It was a frontier shaped by ambition, where government officials envisioned expanding settlements, establishing new communities, and linking distant regions into a growing nation. Maps displayed vast open spaces waiting to be cultivated, surveyed, and governed. On paper, the future looked orderly. Straight boundary lines crossed landscapes that had never known such divisions. The reality on the ground was far more complicated. Long before surveyors measured the land or officials negotiated treaties, these plains had sustained indigenous nations for countless generations. The rhythm of life followed the migration of the buffalo, the changing seasons, and traditions passed from one generation to the next. Knowledge of rivers, forests, medicinal plants, and hunting grounds was not written inside books. It lived within stories, ceremonies, and memory. Every trail carried meaning. Every valley held history. Among the nations living across these territories were the Plains Cree. Their relationship with the land was built upon adaptation and respect rather than ownership. Survival depended upon understanding nature rather than controlling it. Communities moved with the seasons, gathering where resources allowed families to thrive. Children learned not only how to hunt or gather food but how to recognize the signs carried by clouds, birds, and changing winds. Then the buffalo began to disappear. The decline did not happen in a single season. Year after year the great herds grew smaller. Commercial hunting, expanding settlement, and environmental pressures transformed the prairie. What had once appeared endless slowly became scarce. For communities whose lives had been woven around the buffalo, the loss reached far beyond food alone. It disrupted trade, clothing, shelter, ceremony, and identity. Hunger spread quietly at first, then relentlessly. By the early 1880s, many Cree families found themselves facing choices their ancestors had never imagined. They entered treaty negotiations with the Canadian government hoping to secure assistance while preserving a measure of independence. Officials promised food during difficult years, farming equipment, education, and support as communities adjusted to unfamiliar ways of life. Those promises did not always arrive as expected. Government warehouses sometimes contained supplies that were delayed, reduced, or distributed according to policies designed to encourage compliance rather than respond to immediate need. Administrators believed strict control would accelerate transition toward agriculture and settlement. Many indigenous families experienced those same policies as uncertainty layered upon uncertainty. Every delayed shipment deepened frustration. Every empty ration barrel weakened trust. Distance magnified every problem. Messages traveled slowly across hundreds of miles. Decisions made inside offices far away often failed to reflect conditions on the prairie. By the time instructions reached local officials, circumstances had already changed. A harsh winter, poor transportation, or simple miscommunication could leave entire communities waiting for food that had been expected weeks earlier. Frog Lake stood within this fragile world. It was not a large settlement. A church, a mission, government buildings, trading facilities, modest homes, and cultivated fields formed a small pocket of European settlement surrounded by an immense landscape that remained overwhelmingly indigenous. Many of the people living there knew one another personally. Faces became familiar after only a few encounters. Shared isolation encouraged cooperation, even among individuals whose beliefs and backgrounds differed greatly. Catholic missionaries devoted themselves to religious work while attempting to build relationships with nearby Cree communities. Traders exchanged goods that connected local economies with distant markets. Government representatives managed treaty obligations and administrative responsibilities that carried consequences extending well beyond the settlement itself. Every role depended upon trust. Yet trust had become increasingly difficult to maintain. News traveled across the Northwest carrying stories of rising unrest. Conversations around fireplaces and campfires alike turned toward uncertainty. Some settlers worried about their safety. Indigenous communities spoke about broken promises, disappearing resources, and the fear that their children might inherit a future with fewer choices than their parents had known. Rumors flourished where reliable information was scarce. One traveler claimed armed resistance had begun elsewhere. Another insisted government reinforcements were already on their way. Others dismissed such reports entirely. Each new rumor shifted emotions, making ordinary events appear more threatening than they might otherwise have seemed. Against this backdrop stood Big Bear, a respected Cree leader whose influence had been earned through years of leadership rather than force. He believed that his people deserved better treaty terms and greater respect in negotiations with the Canadian government. His goal was not immediate violence but a settlement that acknowledged the realities facing his community. As conditions deteriorated, however, leadership itself became increasingly difficult. Patience is hardest to defend when children are hungry. Every unsuccessful negotiation weakened confidence among those who believed words alone could no longer protect their future. Younger warriors watched supplies diminish while hearing repeated assurances that relief would eventually arrive. To them, waiting seemed less like wisdom and more like surrender. The settlement itself continued its daily rhythm almost unaware of how fragile normal life had become. Smoke rose from chimneys each morning. Families prepared meals from whatever provisions remained available. Horses pulled wagons through muddy tracks as winter slowly retreated. Church bells gathered worshippers whose prayers reflected both gratitude and uncertainty. Ordinary routines often survive until the very moment history interrupts them. Looking back from the present, it is tempting to imagine obvious warning signs scattered everywhere, as though disaster announced itself clearly in advance. History rarely unfolds so neatly. Most people living at Frog Lake believed tomorrow would resemble yesterday. They noticed tensions, certainly, but tensions had existed before without descending into irreversible tragedy. The prairie remained breathtakingly beautiful. Sunlight spilled across open grasslands where melting snow fed small streams winding through the landscape. Birds returned with the changing season, carrying the first unmistakable signs that winter's long silence was ending. Nature continued its ancient cycle, indifferent to the political conflicts unfolding among the people who shared the land. Yet beneath that peaceful horizon, every conversation seemed to carry slightly more weight than before. Every decision felt connected to larger forces that few individuals fully understood. The distance between hope and fear narrowed with each passing day. No single moment transformed Frog Lake from a quiet frontier settlement into a place remembered throughout Canadian history. Instead, countless small moments accumulated over months and years. Delayed promises, shrinking resources, cultural misunderstandings, competing visions for the future, and growing distrust slowly formed the foundation upon which tragedy would eventually stand. When the first days of April arrived in 1885, the settlement appeared much as it always had. But appearances can be deceptive. Beneath the calm surface, the frontier had become a landscape where uncertainty touched every household, every camp, and every heart. The stage had been set not by one decision or one individual, but by years of change that left everyone living there facing a future none of them could fully predict. History often remembers tragedy by counting the dead, recording dates, and preserving official reports. What those records cannot fully capture is the ordinary humanity that existed before a single page of history was written. Before Frog Lake became known across Canada, it was simply home. The people who lived there did not see themselves as characters standing at the edge of a defining historical event. They were fathers and mothers, missionaries and laborious, government employees and traders. They measured their lives not by political movements or military campaigns but by changing seasons, successful harvests, letters from distant relatives, and the quiet routines that made an isolated settlement feel less lonely. Every morning began with familiar responsibilities. Fires were lit before dawn to warm small wooden homes against the lingering cold of early spring. Water had to be carried. Animals required attention before breakfast. Clothing still damp from melting snow hung near stoves where heat slowly chased away the night's chill. The settlement awakened gradually, each household following rhythms shaped by necessity rather than convenience. Among those living at Frog Lake was Thomas Quinn, the government's local Indian agent. His position placed him at the difficult intersection between federal policy and daily reality. Instructions arrived from officials hundreds of miles away, yet the consequences of those instructions unfolded directly before his eyes. Every decision regarding food distribution, treaty obligations, or administrative matters affected families whose circumstances changed faster than government correspondence could keep pace. To some settlers, Quinn represented stability and authority. To many Cree families, however, he became the visible face of policies that seemed increasingly disconnected from their suffering. Whether or not those policies originated with him mattered little to people confronting immediate hardship. On the frontier, distant governments often become embodied in the individuals who carry out their directives. The Catholic missionaries at Frog Lake occupied another unique place within the community. Fathers Leon Adelard Fafford and Felix Marchand devoted themselves to spiritual work, education, and the daily responsibilities of mission life. Their church stood not only as a place of worship but also as a gathering place where familiar faces met through changing seasons. They sought to build relationships across cultural boundaries, believing faith could create common ground where politics often failed. Like many missionaries of the 19th century, their work reflected both genuine personal commitment and the broader colonial attitudes of their era. They hoped to help indigenous communities while also encouraging cultural change according to European religious traditions. These overlapping intentions created relationships that were often sincere on a personal level yet deeply complicated within the larger historical context. Elsewhere in the settlement lived families who had traveled extraordinary distances searching for opportunity. Some had left eastern Canada. Others traced their origins to Europe, carrying memories of villages separated by oceans from the prairie now stretching beyond their windows. Life on the frontier demanded resilience. Every fence, every cultivated field, every newly built structure represented countless hours of labor performed in an environment that could be unforgiving. The isolation shaped relationships in unexpected ways. Disagreements certainly existed, but neighbors also depended upon one another. A broken wagon, an illness, or an unusually harsh winter could quickly remind everyone that survival rarely belonged to individuals alone. Shared hardships often created quiet acts of generosity that never appeared in official records. Food was borrowed. Livestock was watched while families traveled. Repairs became community efforts rather than private concerns. Beyond the settlement, Cree communities faced a different daily reality. For many families, each morning began not with confidence but with uncertainty. Parents wondered whether enough food could be found before another sunset. Elders watched traditions tested by circumstances unlike anything previous generations had experienced. Young people grew up hearing stories of abundant buffalo herds while confronting a landscape where those stories no longer matched what they could see with their own eyes. Hunger changes more than the body. It changes conversations. It changes expectations. It changes the emotional weight carried by every decision. Small disappointments become impossible burdens when survival itself feels uncertain. Patience becomes difficult to defend when children ask questions no parent can easily answer. Among the Cree, Big Bear remained one of the most respected leaders. His authority rested not upon fear but upon years of experience and a reputation for careful judgment. He understood that the old ways of life had been transformed by forces beyond his people's control. At the same time, he believed that accepting unfavorable treaty conditions without negotiation would leave future generations with even fewer opportunities. His leadership required constant balance. He listened to elders who valued diplomacy. He heard younger voices growing impatient. He met government representatives whose priorities did not always reflect the realities unfolding across the prairie. Every discussion carried the weight of an uncertain future. Leadership during peaceful times often means guiding people toward opportunity. Leadership during hardship often means preventing despair from becoming anger. As the months passed, that task became increasingly difficult. Within Cree communities, opinions were far from unanimous. Some believed negotiation remained the wisest path despite repeated frustrations. Others questioned whether negotiations still held any value after promises seemed to arrive too slowly or not at all. These differences reflected not divisions of character but differences in experience, urgency, and hope. Children, meanwhile, continued to find moments of normal life despite the uncertainty surrounding them. They played whenever weather allowed, explored familiar paths, and observed adults whose worried expressions they did not yet fully understand. Their world remained surprisingly small, bounded by families, daily routines, and the landscapes they knew by heart. Looking back through history, it is easy to assign symbolic roles to individuals, reducing them to heroes, villains, or victims. The reality at Frog Lake was far more human. Every person carried personal ambitions, fears, convictions, and limitations. Some believed deeply in the institutions they served. Others believed equally deeply that those institutions had failed them. Most simply hoped their families would survive another difficult season. No one living there possessed the complete picture. Government officials could not fully understand every hardship unfolding within Cree camps. Many settlers could not imagine the depth of hunger spreading across neighboring communities. Many Cree families struggled to understand why promised assistance remained uncertain despite repeated appeals. Each group interpreted events through its own experiences, creating misunderstandings that widened with every passing month. This is perhaps one of history's greatest tragedies. Catastrophic events rarely emerge because one community completely understands another. More often, they arise because people facing entirely different realities believe everyone else sees the world exactly as they do. As spring slowly returned to the prairie, the settlement continued to function. Religious services gathered familiar congregations. Administrative duties continued. Families planned for warmer weather and hoped that better days lay ahead. Yet beneath these ordinary routines, invisible pressures continued to build. Every conversation about food. Every delayed shipment. Every political decision made far away. Every rumor carried by travelers. Each became another thread woven into a story that none of the people at Frog Lake could yet recognize. When later generations remembered the names connected to Frog Lake, they often encountered them first in reports describing loss and conflict. But before history transformed them into historical figures, they were simply people living through uncertain times, trying to make sense of a rapidly changing world. That shared humanity does not erase the profound differences between their experiences, nor does it diminish the suffering that would soon follow. Instead, it reminds us that history's most painful chapters begin not with symbols, but with ordinary lives interrupted by extraordinary events. Morning arrived over Frog Lake with the quiet confidence of an ordinary spring day. Thin patches of snow still rested beneath the trees while the warming sun softened the frozen ground into dark ribbons of mud. Smoke drifted upward from scattered chimneys, dissolving into a pale blue sky that revealed little of what the coming hours would bring. The settlement awoke much as it had countless mornings before. Families prepared breakfast, chores began, and familiar routines offered a comforting sense of stability. In isolated frontier communities, routine carried unusual importance. It reassured people that despite uncertain weather, distant political tensions, and the hardships of frontier life, another ordinary day had begun. Yet beyond the settlement, events across the Northwest had already begun reshaping people's expectations. News of conflict elsewhere had traveled slowly across the prairie. Reports of armed resistance, government mobilization, and growing uncertainty circulated from settlement to settlement, often changing with each retelling. Few people possessed complete information. Rumor filled the empty spaces left by distance and isolation. Within Cree communities, the atmosphere had become increasingly strained. Years of food shortages, frustration over treaty obligations, and declining confidence in government promises had created profound anxiety. Hunger was no longer an emergency but a condition shaping daily life. Many believed they had exhausted every peaceful avenue available to them. Others still hoped restraint could prevent irreversible consequences. Leadership itself had become fragile. Big Bear continued to favor negotiation, but his influence was increasingly challenged by younger men who believed time had run out. Their frustration reflected years of accumulated hardship rather than a single event. Every delayed ration, every disappointing meeting, and every unanswered request contributed to the belief that decisive action would accomplish what diplomacy had not. On the morning of April 2, 1885, a group of armed Cree men led by Wandering Spirit entered Frog Lake and took control of the settlement. The arrival of armed men transformed the atmosphere almost immediately. Conversations stopped. Familiar surroundings suddenly felt unfamiliar. Residents who only moments earlier had been occupied with ordinary concerns found themselves trying to understand a rapidly changing situation. Many hoped the confrontation could still end without bloodshed. The settlement's isolation meant there would be no immediate outside assistance. Whatever happened next would depend entirely upon the decisions made by the people standing there. Residents were instructed to gather and move toward the Cree camp. The instructions created confusion as much as fear. Some complied, believing cooperation offered the safest course. Others struggled to understand what was happening or whether negotiations might still be possible. At the center of the confrontation stood Thomas Quinn, the government's Indian agent. His position had long placed him between government authority and indigenous grievances. In that moment, however, he was no longer merely an administrator. He had become the most visible representative of policies that many among the armed group associated with years of hardship and disappointment. Accounts recorded after the event describe a confrontation that quickly escalated. Efforts to resolve the situation peacefully failed, and the first fatal shot marked the point at which the possibility of a negotiated outcome disappeared. What followed unfolded rapidly. Several unarmed residents lost their lives during the violence that spread through the settlement. Among them were Thomas Quinn, fathers Leon Adelard Fafford and Felix Marchand, along with other settlers whose names would later become permanently linked to Frog Lake. By the end of the day, 9 people had been killed. The violence lasted only a relatively short time. Its consequences would endure for generations. Not everyone present was killed. Several women and children were taken into custody by members of the Cree group. Their experiences during captivity varied, and many were later released unharmed. Their later testimonies became some of the most important first-hand accounts historians used to reconstruct the events of that day. For those who survived, confusion often overshadowed certainty. Memories formed under extreme stress rarely aligned perfectly. Different witnesses remembered conversations differently. They disagreed about timing, movement, and individual actions. Historians studying Frog Lake have therefore approached surviving testimony with caution, comparing multiple accounts rather than relying upon a single narrative. One conclusion, however, remains consistent across modern scholarship. The tragedy did not result from a carefully planned campaign directed by Big Bear. Evidence gathered after the events indicates that Big Bear neither ordered nor desired the killings. Witnesses and later historical analysis suggest that he attempted to restrain the situation but no longer exercised full control over the younger militant faction led by Wandering Spirit. By April 1885, authority within the camp had become divided, reflecting the broader tensions that years of hardship had created. Understanding that distinction does not lessen the suffering experienced by the victims or their families. It does, however, remind us that historical responsibility is rarely simple. Within hours, Frog Lake had been transformed. Buildings still stood, but the settlement no longer represented the quiet frontier community it had been only that morning. Families had been separated. Familiar faces were suddenly absent. Those who survived faced immediate uncertainty, unsure what would happen next or whether additional violence might follow. The tragedy also reverberated far beyond the settlement itself. News traveled across Canada carrying reports that shocked distant communities. Newspapers often presented the event in simplified terms, emphasizing fear while overlooking the years of famine, political conflict, and failed relationships that had preceded it. For many readers thousands of miles away, Frog Lake became a symbol of frontier danger. For Indigenous communities, it became another chapter in a much larger story of displacement, desperation, and the collapse of trust. Even today, historians continue to examine that April morning from multiple perspectives. The names of those who died remain an essential part of the historical record, as do the experiences of the survivors and the broader circumstances that led to the confrontation. The event stands not only as a profound human tragedy but also as a reminder that prolonged hunger, political failure, cultural misunderstanding, and fear can combine to produce consequences that no community can fully escape. By sunset, the quiet settlement that had greeted the morning with ordinary routines had become a place forever marked by loss. The prairie itself remained unchanged. The wind still crossed the open fields, and the sky stretched endlessly above the land. Yet for everyone connected to Frog Lake, nothing about that landscape would ever feel ordinary again. When the violence ended, silence settled over Frog Lake with a weight that seemed almost impossible to describe. The settlement that had awakened to another ordinary spring morning now stood suspended in uncertainty. Doors remained open where they had been hurriedly abandoned. Cooking fires slowly burned themselves out. Tools lay where they had been dropped, ordinary objects transformed into quiet reminders that daily life had been interrupted without warning. For those who survived, the immediate concern was not understanding history but enduring the next few hours. Communication with the outside world was virtually non-existent. The nearest settlements lay far away across difficult terrain, and there was no rapid means of sending word. The isolation that had once defined frontier life as peaceful now became one of its greatest vulnerabilities. Several women and children who had been taken from the settlement remained uncertain about what their future would hold. Their circumstances depended upon decisions made within the Cree camp rather than any authority beyond it. Later accounts suggest that many among the Cree did not seek further bloodshed against non-combatants, and over time the captives were treated differently by different individuals before eventually being released. Those experiences, recorded after their return, would later become valuable historical sources, though historians recognize that memories shaped by trauma inevitably carried emotion alongside observation. In the days immediately following the confrontation, Frog Lake itself remained largely inaccessible to outside investigators. News spread gradually through travelers, scouts, and scattered communications moving across the Northwest. Every retelling introduced new details, omitted others, and reflected the perspective of the person carrying the story. Before official investigators ever reached the settlement, multiple versions of events had already begun circulating. Some reports exaggerated what had occurred. Others omitted the years of tension that had preceded it. Very few possessed the complete picture. Only after information reached government authorities did officials begin assembling a clearer understanding of what had happened. Messages traveled from one administrative post to another, each adding fragments to an incomplete narrative. The deaths of government employees and missionaries immediately elevated the event from a local tragedy to a matter of national concern. Officials recognized that Frog Lake was no longer an isolated incident. It had become part of the expanding crisis unfolding throughout the Northwest. As military forces increased their presence across the region in response to the wider Northwest Rebellion, attention gradually turned toward documenting the events at Frog Lake. Investigators relied heavily upon surviving witnesses, released captives, correspondence from officials, and the observations of those who eventually entered the settlement after the danger had subsided. What they found reflected not only the immediate aftermath of violence but also the abandonment of an entire community. Buildings stood empty. Household possessions remained where families had left them. Personal belongings, books, clothing, tools, and religious objects quietly testified that Frog Lake had once been a functioning settlement rather than merely the scene of a historical event. The physical environment itself offered only limited evidence. Unlike modern investigations, 19th-century authorities possessed neither forensic laboratories nor standardized crime scene procedures. There were no fingerprint databases, no DNA analysis, and no systematic methods for preserving every piece of physical evidence. Investigators depended instead upon careful observation, written testimony, sketches, and interviews. As a result, witness statements assumed extraordinary importance. Every survivor remembered events through a deeply personal lens. Some focused on conversations. Others recalled movements, expressions, or decisions made during moments of confusion. Small differences between accounts did not necessarily indicate dishonesty. Historians today understand that traumatic experiences often produce fragmented memories rather than perfectly synchronized recollections. One question emerged almost immediately. Who had been responsible for the decisions that transformed confrontation into tragedy? Early newspaper reports often offered simple answers. Complexity rarely traveled as quickly as certainty. In many publications, responsibility appeared concentrated upon broad groups rather than specific individuals. Such reporting reflected the fears and political attitudes of the period as much as the evidence available. As additional testimony accumulated, however, distinctions became increasingly important. Witnesses consistently described Wandering Spirit as the principal leader directing the armed group during the confrontation. His actions occupied a central place within nearly every reconstruction of the day's events. At the same time, testimony concerning Big Bear presented a more complicated picture. Rather than depicting him as directing the violence, several accounts suggested that his influence had diminished and that he had attempted unsuccessfully to restrain events once they began moving beyond his control. This distinction became one of the most significant historical questions surrounding Frog Lake. Leadership within indigenous communities, like leadership anywhere, was not absolute. Respect did not necessarily guarantee obedience, especially during periods of extreme hardship. The growing divide between elders favoring negotiation and younger men demanding immediate action had become increasingly visible before April 1885. Investigators therefore faced the difficult task of separating symbolic leadership from direct operational responsibility. Meanwhile, the broader situation across the Northwest continued evolving. Frog Lake could not be investigated in isolation because it unfolded within the larger conflict already spreading across the region. Government officials viewed every new report through the lens of maintaining order and restoring authority. Military operations proceeded alongside investigative efforts, often influencing both the availability of witnesses and the priorities of officials. 2 days after the confrontation, parts of the abandoned settlement were burned. By the time many officials later examined the site, important physical details had already been altered or destroyed. The fire further complicated efforts to reconstruct events solely through material evidence, increasing dependence upon testimony gathered from those who had witnessed the tragedy. For historians studying Frog Lake today, this combination of limited physical evidence and extensive eyewitness testimony presents both opportunity and challenge. Personal accounts provide emotional depth impossible to recover through archaeology alone, yet every memory must be evaluated alongside other sources. Official reports, military correspondence, missionary records, indigenous oral histories, and later scholarly research together create a fuller understanding than any single document could provide. Perhaps the most enduring lesson from the investigation is that history itself functions much like an unfinished conversation. Every surviving record reflects a particular perspective shaped by its author's experiences, responsibilities, and beliefs. Government officials documented administrative concerns. Missionaries emphasized spiritual and humanitarian loss. Survivors described fear and uncertainty. Cree oral traditions preserved memories rooted in generations of broader historical experience. None alone tells the entire story. Together, they reveal a tragedy far more complex than early public narratives suggested. As investigators gradually assembled names, timelines, and testimony, Frog Lake ceased to exist merely as a remote settlement. It entered the historical record as one of the defining events of the Northwest Rebellion, prompting questions that extended well beyond the boundaries of a single community. How had years of negotiation failed so completely? Why had trust deteriorated to such an extent? Could different political decisions have prevented the catastrophe? Those questions would continue shaping both legal proceedings and historical debate long after the settlement itself had disappeared from everyday life. By the time officials completed their initial inquiries, one reality had become unmistakably clear. The investigation would not end with identifying what had happened on a single April morning. It would require confronting the much longer history that had made such a tragedy possible in the first place. In the weeks and months that followed the events at Frog Lake, the question facing authorities was no longer simply what had happened, but how to make sense of a situation that refused to fit neatly into any single explanation. Reports had already circulated widely, shaping public perception long before a complete investigation could be assembled. By the time officials began organizing testimony systematically, the narrative surrounding Frog Lake had already hardened in the public imagination into something far simpler than the reality they were now attempting to reconstruct. The process of clarification did not arrive as a single revelation. It emerged slowly, piece by piece, through the careful comparison of accounts that often disagreed in detail but aligned in broader structure. Military records provided one layer of documentation, describing movements across the region during the wider Northwest Rebellion. Administrative correspondence offered another, reflecting the pressures faced by government agents operating in isolated conditions. Survivor testimony added human perspective, often fragmented but essential in understanding the lived experience of those present. As investigators compared these sources, certain patterns began to emerge more clearly. One of the most significant developments was the growing distinction between symbolic authority and direct control during the confrontation at Frog Lake. Early public discourse tended to treat leadership within indigenous groups as uniform and centralized, an assumption shaped more by external political frameworks than by the internal realities of Cree governance at the time. The evidence, however, suggested a more complex structure in which influence was distributed and sometimes contested. Within this emerging understanding, Big Bear's position became a central point of reassessment. Earlier interpretations, influenced by immediate reactions to the violence, often associated him directly with the actions taken during the confrontation. Yet as more testimony was collected, a different picture began to form. Accounts from multiple perspectives indicated that while Big Bear held significant leadership authority, his control over all members of the group had weakened considerably by the time of the events at Frog Lake. His emphasis on negotiation and restraint appeared increasingly at odds with the decisions being made by younger, more militant individuals who were responding to accumulated frustration and deteriorating conditions. This distinction did not emerge easily. It required careful cross-examination of witness statements, many of which were shaped by fear, trauma, or the limitations of observation during rapidly unfolding events. It also required historians and officials to confront the uncomfortable reality that leadership in moments of crisis is often neither absolute nor consistent. Authority can fracture under pressure, and decisions can emerge from tensions within a group rather than directives from a single individual. Another important development in the investigation involved the role of Wandering Spirit. Testimony consistently identified him as a key figure in the actions taken during the confrontation. His presence appears across multiple independent accounts, suggesting a level of direct involvement in guiding the armed group during the critical moments at Frog Lake. However, even in this case, the historical record reveals not a simple portrait of unilateral command, but rather a situation in which urgency, anger, and breakdowns in communication contributed to a rapidly escalating sequence of events. The so-called breakthrough in understanding Frog Lake did not come from a single document or decisive piece of evidence. Instead, it came from the gradual realization that the event could not be fully explained through the lens of individual intent alone. It was the product of converging pressures that had been building for years: the collapse of the Buffalo economy, the failures and inconsistencies of treaty implementation, the emotional and psychological toll of prolonged hunger, and the growing disconnect between government policy and lived reality on the plains. As this broader context became more widely acknowledged among historians, the interpretation of Frog Lake began to shift. Early accounts had often emphasized immediate causation, focusing narrowly on the confrontation itself. Later analysis increasingly placed the event within a longer trajectory of structural conditions that shaped the behavior of all parties involved. This did not diminish personal responsibility, but it reframed it within a wider system of historical forces. Government investigators and military officials at the time were still constrained by the priorities of their institutions. Their primary objective was to restore order and establish accountability within the framework of colonial law. Historians working in later decades, however, gained access to a broader range of perspectives, including indigenous oral histories that preserved understandings of the period not always reflected in official documentation. The integration of these sources marked an important turning point in how Frog Lake was studied and remembered. With time, the interpretation of Big Bear's role became one of the most debated aspects of the case. Rather than being viewed solely through the immediate aftermath of the event, his actions were increasingly examined within the full scope of his leadership during a period of extreme crisis. This shift did not erase the complexity of responsibility, but it did challenge earlier simplifications that had dominated public discourse in the immediate aftermath. The deeper breakthrough, therefore, was not a discovery of a single hidden fact, but a change in perspective. Frog Lake came to be understood not as an isolated eruption of violence, but as a moment embedded within a much larger historical transformation. It reflected the collision between two systems of life and governance under conditions where communication had broken down and survival itself had become uncertain. In this sense, the investigation into Frog Lake never truly concluded. Instead, it evolved into an ongoing process of reinterpretation, shaped by new scholarship, changing historical methodologies, and a growing recognition of the need to incorporate multiple perspectives. Each generation that revisits the event encounters not only the facts of what occurred, but also the responsibility of interpreting those facts within a more complete understanding of the past. The so-called breakthrough, then, was not a final answer. It was the realization that no single answer could fully contain the complexity of what had unfolded at Frog Lake, and that understanding it required moving beyond certainty toward context, depth, and historical empathy. In the aftermath of the events at Frog Lake, the machinery of colonial justice began to move with a speed and rigidity shaped by the political urgency of the time. The Northwest Rebellion had not only shaken isolated settlements but had also challenged the authority of the Canadian government across a vast and rapidly changing frontier. Within this atmosphere, legal proceedings were never separate from broader questions of control, stability, and public confidence. Those who were identified as participants in the events were eventually taken into custody as military operations expanded across the region. Their transport to places of detention marked a transition from the uncertainty of frontier conflict into the formal structure of colonial legal systems. Yet even at this stage, the boundaries between justice and political necessity were not always clearly defined. The courts that would hear these cases operated within a system still adapting to the realities of governing distant territories with limited infrastructure and significant cultural complexity. The trials that followed were conducted under conditions that reflected both legal procedure and the pressures of a nation attempting to assert authority. Evidence presented in court was drawn from a combination of military reports, administrative records, and witness testimony. Each category of evidence carried its own limitations. Military accounts often emphasized order and command structure. Civil records focused on administrative responsibility. Witness statements, meanwhile, varied significantly depending on perspective, memory, and the emotional weight of the events being recalled. Within this framework, the individuals associated with leadership roles during the Frog Lake events were evaluated according to the legal standards of the period. The distinction between direct action and broader participation in collective decision-making became central to the proceedings. Colonial law at the time placed strong emphasis on establishing clear lines of responsibility, yet the reality of the situation being examined did not always align neatly with those legal categories. Wandering spirit emerged in court records as a central figure in the events under examination. Testimony and evidence attributed significant involvement to him in the actions that took place during the confrontation. The legal process sought to determine the extent of his responsibility within the structure of authority that had existed at the time. In doing so, the court attempted to translate a rapidly unfolding and emotionally charged historical moment into the formal language of law, where intent, action, and accountability could be distinctly categorized. At the same time, the case of Big Bear occupied a different position within the proceedings. Unlike those identified as direct participants in the violence, his role was evaluated through the lens of leadership and influence rather than immediate action. The legal question centered not only on what he had done, but on what authority he possessed over others during a moment when internal divisions within the group were already evident. Testimony suggesting his attempts to restrain escalation was considered alongside the broader context of diminished control under conditions of crisis. The resulting judgments reflected both legal reasoning and the broader political environment in which they were delivered. Several individuals were ultimately found guilty and received sentences that were consistent with the colonial legal framework of the time. These outcomes were presented as necessary measures to restore order and reaffirm governmental authority across the region. Public communication surrounding the verdicts emphasized stability, deterrence, and the re-establishment of law in a territory that had recently experienced widespread unrest. Big Bear himself was also subjected to legal consequences related to his perceived role within the wider events of the rebellion. His sentencing became one of the most discussed aspects of the aftermath, particularly because it highlighted the complexities of assigning responsibility in situations where leadership was contested and authority was not absolute. The court's decision reflected an attempt to balance evidence of intent, influence, and the limitations of control under rapidly changing circumstances. Beyond the courtroom, reactions to the outcomes varied significantly depending on perspective. For many settlers and officials, the verdicts represented closure and a necessary reaffirmation of order following a period of fear and uncertainty. For others, particularly within indigenous communities, the trials were viewed through a more complex lens shaped by long-standing grievances, differing understandings of justice, and the broader context of treaty relations and resource scarcity. Historians examining these proceedings in later years have often emphasized the importance of situating them within their historical context. The legal system of the late 19th century operated under assumptions and priorities that reflected the colonial structure of governance in Canada at the time. Concepts of responsibility, authority, and justice were interpreted through frameworks that did not always fully account for Indigenous governance systems or the lived realities of frontier conditions. As a result, the trials related to Frog Lake are now understood not only as legal events but also as historical artifacts that reveal how justice was administered in a period of profound transformation. They illustrate the ways in which law functioned as both a mechanism of accountability and a tool of political consolidation during the expansion of state authority across the Northwest. Over time, the formal proceedings came to an end, but the questions they raised did not. The relationship between law and history, between individual responsibility and structural forces, and between different interpretations of justice continued to shape scholarly discussion long after the courtroom records were closed. In this sense, the justice that followed Frog Lake did not provide a final resolution. Instead, it marked another stage in a much longer process of attempting to understand how and why such events occurred, and how societies choose to respond when history places them in moments of irreversible consequence. In the years that followed the events at Frog Lake, the settlement itself gradually disappeared from its original form. Buildings that once held daily life either decayed under the weight of weather and time or were repurposed as the frontier continued to change. What remained was not the physical structure of the place, but its place within historical memory. Frog Lake became a reference point, a moment that scholars, communities, and governments would continue to revisit in search of understanding. For many Canadians, the events became associated with the broader narrative of the Northwest Rebellion, a period in which questions of authority, land, and survival intersected with the expansion of the Canadian state. In official histories written during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the focus often rested on themes of order, conflict, and the assertion of governmental control across the Western Territories. These accounts tended to simplify complex realities into more linear stories of rebellion and response. Over time, however, historical interpretation began to shift. As access to diverse sources increased and as historical methodology evolved, scholars started to examine the deeper structural conditions that shaped the events at Frog Lake. Rather than viewing the incident in isolation, they placed it within the broader context of treaty implementation, economic collapse brought on by the disappearance of the buffalo, and the profound disruption experienced by indigenous societies during this period of rapid colonial expansion. This shift in perspective did not diminish the human tragedy at the center of the story. Instead, it expanded the frame through which that tragedy was understood. The individuals whose lives were lost were no longer seen only as names in official records, but as participants in a complex historical landscape shaped by forces far beyond any single moment of decision. At the same time, the actions of those involved on all sides were examined with greater attention to the pressures, constraints, and misunderstandings that influenced behavior under extreme conditions. Within Indigenous communities, memory of the period has often been preserved through oral histories that emphasize continuity, resilience, and the long-term consequences of colonial policy. These perspectives highlight not only the events at Frog Lake itself but also the broader transformation of life on the plains, where traditional patterns of subsistence and governance were disrupted by environmental change and state expansion. In this context, Frog Lake is understood not as an isolated episode, but as part of a longer story of adaptation and survival. For descendants of those who lived through the period, the legacy of Frog Lake remains complex. It is a reminder of a moment when multiple histories collided under conditions of severe stress and limited communication. It also serves as a point of reflection on how misunderstanding, scarcity, and structural inequality can converge in ways that reshape entire communities. The event continues to appear in educational materials, historical research, and public discourse, often prompting renewed discussion about how such histories should be remembered and taught. From the perspective of modern historical analysis, one of the most important lessons of Frog Lake is the danger of reducing complex human situations into simple moral categories. The people involved were not shaped by a single motivation or a single narrative. They were individuals responding to hunger, uncertainty, responsibility, fear, duty, and hope within a rapidly changing world. Their decisions were made in environments where information was incomplete and where the consequences of action or inaction could not always be fully predicted. The passage of time has not resolved the interpretive challenges surrounding Frog Lake, nor has it erased the emotional weight associated with its history. Instead, it has allowed for a more layered understanding, one that recognizes both the immediacy of human suffering and the long-term structures that contributed to it. In this sense, the event continues to function as a case study in how historical forces operate across multiple levels simultaneously, from individual experience to systemic transformation. Today, the story of Frog Lake is approached not only as a historical incident but also as a subject of reflection about memory, responsibility, and interpretation. It invites ongoing examination of how societies construct narratives about difficult pasts, and how those narratives evolve as new voices and perspectives are included in the historical record. In the end, what remains most significant is not only what happened in the spring of 1885, but how that moment continues to be understood. Frog Lake endures in historical consciousness as a reminder that the past is never static. It is continually reinterpreted, reconsidered, and re-examined, shaped by each generation's attempt to find meaning in events that resist simple explanation. And within that ongoing process of remembrance, the silence that once settled over the prairie has never truly disappeared. It has simply changed form, becoming part of the way history itself is still being written. When a place like Frog Lake enters history, it stops belonging only to geography and begins to exist within memory. What happened there in 1885 is no longer confined to a single moment in time. It has become part of a longer conversation about how societies understand crisis, how they interpret responsibility, and how they remember events shaped by fear, scarcity, and miscommunication. Over time, the details of that spring have been recorded, studied, debated, and reinterpreted by historians, communities, and descendants who continue to seek clarity in a story that resists simple closure. Each generation encounters the same facts, but not the same questions. What once may have been framed primarily through the lens of order and rebellion is now increasingly examined through broader considerations of context, including the collapse of ecological systems, the pressures of colonial policy, and the breakdown of trust between communities sharing the same land under profoundly unequal circumstances. Yet even as interpretation evolves, the human reality at the center of the story remains unchanged. People lived there. They spoke to one another. They tried to secure food, maintain families, uphold beliefs, and navigate uncertainty in a world that was shifting faster than any of them could fully comprehend. Some believed in negotiation. Some believed in resistance. Some believed in maintaining fragile routines in the hope that stability would return. None of them possessed the full picture of the forces converging around them. This is often the quiet truth behind historical tragedy. It is rarely born from a single decision or a single moment. Instead, it emerges gradually, from accumulated pressures that build until they can no longer be contained within existing structures. When that point is reached, events unfold in ways that later appear sudden but were, in reality, the result of long and complex trajectories. Frog Lake stands as one of those moments where history became visible in its most human form. Not as abstract forces moving across maps, but as decisions made under uncertainty by individuals who could not see beyond the immediate constraints of their time. It reflects the fragility of communication between communities, the consequences of systemic breakdowns in trust, and the profound impact of material conditions on human relationships. In remembering such events, there is a responsibility not only to record what occurred, but to resist the temptation to simplify it. Simplification may offer comfort, but it often obscures understanding. Complexity, on the other hand, requires patience. It asks us to hold multiple perspectives at once, even when they do not easily align. It demands recognition that historical truth is often layered, and that clarity does not always mean certainty. The legacy of Frog Lake therefore does not rest solely in the past. It continues to influence how later generations think about justice, governance, and historical memory. It challenges readers of history to consider how narratives are formed, who gets to shape them, and what is lost when context is stripped away in favor of simpler explanations. More than a century later, the prairie where these events unfolded has returned to quiet. The landscape has changed in appearance, yet it still carries traces of its history in ways that are not always visible. Memory persists not in the land itself, but in the act of remembering it. And perhaps that is the final meaning carried by Frog Lake. Not closure, but reflection. Not a single interpretation, but an ongoing effort to understand how human lives intersect with larger forces, and how those intersections become the stories that endure long after the events themselves have passed into history. History does not end when the last page is written, and it does not remain fixed in the form in which it was first recorded. It continues to shift as new voices enter the conversation and as societies reconsider what they thought they already understood. Frog Lake exists within that ongoing movement of interpretation, where memory and analysis remain in constant dialogue. What remains most important is not only the sequence of events that occurred in the spring of 1885, but the conditions that allowed those events to unfold. Long before any confrontation took place, there were years of environmental collapse, political negotiation, cultural misunderstanding, and administrative failure that shaped the world in which people were forced to make decisions under pressure. These conditions did not determine individual actions in a mechanical sense, but they created the boundaries within which those actions became possible. When historians revisit Frog Lake today, they are not only reconstructing a timeline. They are also examining the relationship between structure and agency, between systemic forces and human choice. This dual perspective is essential to understanding how history operates, especially in moments where different societies, with different expectations and survival strategies, encounter one another under conditions of extreme imbalance. The individuals connected to Frog Lake have long since passed from living memory, but their experiences remain accessible through records, testimonies, and oral histories that continue to be studied and reinterpreted. Each source carries its own limitations, shaped by the position of the person who created it and the context in which it was produced. Yet when considered together, they form a mosaic of perspectives that resists reduction into a single, simplified narrative. This resistance to simplification is perhaps the most enduring lesson of the event. It reminds us that historical understanding requires patience and a willingness to sit with complexity rather than resolve it prematurely. It also highlights the importance of acknowledging that different communities may carry different memories of the same moment, each shaped by distinct experiences and inherited knowledge. In contemporary discussions of the past, Frog Lake often serves as a point of reflection on how histories are constructed and how they evolve over time. It raises questions about whose voices are preserved, whose interpretations are amplified, and how future generations will continue to engage with events that remain emotionally and historically significant. These questions do not have final answers, but they remain essential to any serious engagement with the past. As time moves further away from the events themselves, the physical traces of Frog Lake have faded, but its presence in historical discourse has not diminished. If anything, it has become more layered, as new scholarship continues to revisit old assumptions and incorporate perspectives that were previously overlooked or underrepresented. In this way, the story of Frog Lake is not static, but continuously reshaped by the act of remembering itself. What ultimately endures is not a single interpretation, but the recognition that history is always more complex than the narratives first used to describe it. Behind every recorded event lies a network of conditions, relationships, and decisions that cannot be fully captured in any single account. Frog Lake stands as a reminder of that complexity, and of the responsibility that comes with attempting to understand it. And so the story does not conclude in the traditional sense. It continues, not in the form of events, but in the form of interpretation, reflection, and dialogue across time. The past remains present not because it repeats itself, but because it asks to be understood again and again, from different perspectives and with greater depth each time it is revisited. Every historical story eventually reaches a point where the facts no longer change, but their meaning continues to evolve. Frog Lake is one of those stories. The events that unfolded there in 1885 are fixed in time, recorded in documents, testimonies, and memory. Yet the understanding of those events remains open, shaped by each generation that returns to them with new questions and different sensitivities. What makes Frog Lake difficult to reduce into a simple narrative is not a lack of information, but an excess of it. There are official records that reflect the priorities of government institutions. There are personal accounts that carry the weight of individual experience. There are oral histories that preserve perspectives passed through generations. Each source offers clarity in one dimension while leaving gaps in another. Together, they form a history that is layered rather than linear. To study Frog Lake is to confront the reality that historical events are rarely the product of a single cause. They emerge instead from overlapping conditions that develop over long periods of time. Environmental collapse, economic disruption, political pressure, cultural misunderstanding, and institutional failure all shaped the world in which those events became possible. None of these factors alone can fully explain what happened, but none can be removed without losing essential context. Within this complexity, human decisions still matter. Individuals acted within constraints, but they also made choices that carried consequences for themselves and others. Understanding this balance between structure and agency is one of the central challenges of historical interpretation. It requires resisting the urge to simplify and instead accepting that multiple truths can exist within the same event. Over time, the way Frog Lake is remembered has changed. Early interpretations often reflected the immediate needs of a society attempting to restore order and define responsibility in the aftermath of conflict. Later scholarship has increasingly emphasized broader context, incorporating perspectives that were once marginalized or absent from official narratives. This evolution does not replace earlier accounts, but it expands them, adding depth to the collective understanding of what occurred. The prairie where these events took place has long since returned to quiet. Physical traces of the settlement have faded, but the story remains present in historical discourse, education, and cultural memory. Its persistence is not tied to the land itself, but to the ongoing effort to understand how and why such events happen, and what they reveal about the societies involved. Frog Lake ultimately resists closure. It does not resolve neatly into heroism or tragedy alone, nor does it conform to a single moral interpretation. Instead, it remains a reminder that history is often shaped in moments where certainty collapses and people are forced to act within incomplete understanding. In those moments, the distance between intention and consequence can become vast, and the effects can echo far beyond the original context. To remember Frog Lake is therefore not only to recall what occurred, but to engage with the larger questions it raises about responsibility, memory, and interpretation. It is to recognize that history is not simply something that happened in the past, but something that continues to be actively constructed through the way it is studied and retold. And in that ongoing process, the most important task is not to find a final version of the story, but to remain willing to return to it, to examine it again, and to understand it with greater care each time. When we look back at events like Frog Lake, there is always a temptation to search for a single defining explanation, a moment where everything changed, or a single decision that can be isolated as the cause of everything that followed. But history rarely offers that kind of clarity. Instead, it presents us with a sequence of pressures, contradictions, and human responses that accumulate over time until they can no longer be contained within existing structures. Frog Lake is best understood not as an isolated incident, but as the convergence of long-term forces that shaped life across the Northwest during a period of profound transformation. Environmental change had already disrupted traditional ways of life. Economic systems tied to the buffalo economy had collapsed. Political agreements had been made under conditions of unequal power and were implemented in ways that often failed to meet the expectations or needs of those most affected. Each of these factors alone created strain. Together, they produced instability that affected every level of daily existence. Within that instability, human beings continued to make decisions. Some pursued negotiation, believing that dialogue could still preserve stability. Others believed that conditions had deteriorated beyond the point where patience alone could ensure survival. Still others attempted simply to maintain continuity in their daily lives, hoping that larger forces beyond their control would eventually settle into a more predictable pattern. None of these positions existed in isolation from the others, and none had full knowledge of how the situation as a whole would unfold. This is what makes Frog Lake difficult to reduce into a single narrative. It is not a story defined by one perspective, but by the coexistence of many perspectives that do not always align. Historical records preserve fragments of those perspectives, but no single record contains the full picture. Official documents, personal testimonies, and oral histories each illuminate different aspects of the same reality, while also revealing the limitations inherent in any attempt to fully reconstruct the past. Over time, interpretations of Frog Lake have shifted as historians, communities, and readers have revisited the available evidence. Earlier accounts often reflected the immediate need to establish order and assign responsibility within a rapidly expanding colonial system. Later interpretations have increasingly emphasized the broader structural conditions that shaped the environment in which events occurred. This ongoing evolution of understanding does not replace earlier perspectives, but rather places them within a wider and more complex framework. In this sense, Frog Lake continues to function as a historical case study in how societies remember and interpret moments of crisis. It raises questions not only about what happened, but about how knowledge of what happened is constructed. It challenges us to consider how different forms of evidence interact, how narratives are shaped over time, and how meaning is assigned to events that cannot be fully contained within any single explanation. The physical site itself has long since returned to the landscape. The settlement no longer exists in the form it once did, and the daily lives that once unfolded there have become part of history. Yet the significance of Frog Lake persists, not because the place remains unchanged, but because the questions it raises continue to resonate. It remains a point of reflection on the fragility of communication between communities, the consequences of systemic breakdowns, and the complexity of human decision-making under pressure. To engage with this history is not to arrive at a final conclusion, but to participate in an ongoing process of interpretation. Each generation returns to it with different frameworks, different priorities, and different sensitivities. In doing so, they reshape the meaning of the past while also being shaped by it. Frog Lake, therefore, endures not as a closed chapter, but as an open one. Its story continues in the way it is studied, remembered, and discussed. And perhaps the most important lesson it offers is that history is never truly finished. It is continuously revised, continuously reinterpreted, and continuously re-examined in the effort to better understand the complex realities from which it emerged. When we step back from the details of any single historical event, what remains is not only what happened, but how it continues to be understood. Frog Lake belongs to that category of history where meaning does not settle into a fixed form. Instead, it shifts depending on the distance from which it is viewed, the sources that are prioritized, and the questions that are asked of it. The events of 1885 unfolded within a world already under immense strain. Environmental collapse had disrupted long-established ways of life. Economic systems tied to the land had been fundamentally altered. Political agreements attempted to bridge differences between vastly different systems of governance and understanding, but those agreements were implemented in ways that often failed to reflect the realities experienced on the ground. In such conditions, misunderstanding was not an exception. It was a structural feature of daily life. Within this environment, individuals acted according to their circumstances, beliefs, and constraints. Some sought to maintain dialogue even as trust weakened. Others responded to immediate hardship with urgency that left little room for patience. Many simply tried to endure, navigating each day with limited information and narrowing options. These human responses unfolded within pressures that were already in motion long before any single moment of confrontation occurred. What makes Frog Lake historically significant is not only the event itself, but the way it reflects the broader dynamics of a period marked by rapid transformation and unequal power relationships. It illustrates how fragile communication can become when systems of governance, survival, and cultural understanding are not aligned. It also demonstrates how quickly uncertainty can expand when multiple crises converge at the same time. Over the decades, interpretations of Frog Lake have changed as historical methods have evolved and as more voices have been included in the telling of the past. Early narratives often emphasized order, conflict, and resolution within a narrow framework of institutional perspective. Later scholarship has increasingly focused on broader context, incorporating environmental, economic, and social dimensions that help explain how such events became possible. This shift does not erase earlier accounts, but it situates them within a larger and more complex field of understanding. At the same time, the human dimension of the story remains central. Behind every document and every historical analysis were people living through uncertainty, making decisions without knowing their long-term consequences, and trying to navigate conditions that were rapidly changing around them. The importance of recognizing this human dimension lies not in simplifying responsibility, but in understanding how historical forces operate through lived experience. Today, Frog Lake exists primarily within memory, scholarship, and cultural reflection. The physical landscape has changed, and the settlement itself no longer stands as it once did. What endures is the ongoing effort to interpret its significance, to understand the conditions that shaped it, and to place it within a broader narrative of history that continues to evolve. In this sense, Frog Lake does not offer closure. Instead, it offers perspective. It reminds us that history is rarely the product of isolated moments, but rather the result of long processes that accumulate over time. It also reminds us that the way we understand the past is never final, but always subject to revision as new evidence and new perspectives emerge. The story ultimately resists simplification. It asks for careful attention rather than quick conclusions, and for an awareness that historical understanding is an ongoing responsibility rather than a completed task. In returning to it, we are not only looking backward, but also considering how we choose to interpret complexity, uncertainty, and human experience itself. And perhaps that is where the story truly ends, not with resolution, but with the recognition that the past remains present in the questions we continue to ask about it.